Hello music lovers, welcome to this channel. Thanks so much for dropping by this video. I really appreciate it. You know, for the past 6 years, Chris and Rich Robinson of the Black Crowes haven't been speaking to each other. They've been trading insults. Well, that is up until recently. They just announced that they're getting the Black Crowes back together, hitting the road for a 30th anniversary tour. But it's going to be without their longtime drummer and co-founder, Steve Gorman. Now, Steve just wrote a book called Hard to Handle: The Life and Death of the Black Crowes, a Memoir. And in this book, Steve says the following: in the grand scheme of things, I'm forever grateful for the experience. As for me and Chris, we had huge ups and downs for years. He and I had conversations that lasted hours upon hours, leading me to feel connected to him as a brother. And the next day or 10 minutes later, we'd be telling each other to fuck off. For almost 30 years, we played very different roles at very different times in each other's lives. We've been roommates, bandmates, friends, and enemies, but no more. So this begs the question, what the hell happened? Why doesn't Steve factor into this 30th anniversary tour? Why are these fighting brothers getting back together again? And so many other questions, such as, why was Joe Perry of Aerosmith such a dick to the Black Crowes? Did Chris Robinson really hate light beer and corporate sponsorships? Was Kate Hudson the Yoko Ono of the Black Crowes? What made Vanilla Ice scurry in such a hurry? What the hell really happened after this Tonight Show performance with Jimmy Page? And lastly, what did Keith Richards of the Rolling Stones have to say when asked if he knew of the Black Crowes? All this and more than you can handle coming up. All right, so I just finished reading Steve Gorman's great new book, and I recommend it highly if you enjoy this kind of stuff. I love these books because they give a great insight into the world that these bands are submersed in, you know, the paths that they cross and the interesting characters coming in and out. It's all about the Black Crowes, all about the relationship that he had with the Robinson brothers and how he helped to co-found this band and all that they went through. And he says that the angst between the Robinson brothers was always there. They were always punching the balls off each other. There was so much anger between them, always fighting. You kind of get the impression there were like more pricks than a needle factory going on here in the Black Crowes. Just so much anxiety and so much anger that could explode at any given moment. And you know, Steve doesn't really know where all this anger kind of came from. As far as he knew, the Robinson family was a very happy family. The parents were very proud and loyal and supportive. He did know that Chris's father was a bit critical of how Chris used to sing early on. You know, he used to tell Chris that he couldn't carry a tune in a fucking bucket. But, you know, and maybe that's why Chris had this kind of like, I'll show you attitude that kind of swamped everything that he ever did. And, you know, Rich, who's the younger brother by a couple of years, he is kind of the more withdrawn brother. He doesn't say a whole lot, kind of socially awkward, not very sociable. He's also the only one that was sober throughout this entire mess. You know, whenever Steve Gorman would talk about the drug use, you know, whether it was the cocaine coming out or the weed or even the alcohol, he would always say, well, except for Rich. You know, Rich always kept himself clean. Now, Chris, you know, the older brother, he's described as being very, very manic and just exhausting, you know, and he would always pick on Rich, and they would fight a lot. Steve would tell Rich, you know, look, if you want this shit to end, you just got to kick his ass. You know, that's all you got to do is just clock him good once, and Chris probably won't pick on you a whole lot if he knows he's going to get his ass kicked. But that never happened. Rich just put up with it, and they just constantly fought. And there were times where they did agree, but it wasn't for very, very long, and then they'd be right back at it for some stupid thing would blow up and just throw everything right off course. In terms of music, Steve would describe Rich as the lumber and Chris was the architect. You know, Rich would have all these great pieces, he'd have these riffs and these melodies and everything, and Chris knew how to arrange it and turn it into a proper song. So for the first tour, the Crows were out with Aerosmith, who were going through a very sober phase, or as Gorman would say, it was an aggressively sober phase because they didn't want any drugs or alcohol around at all, like not even on the days off. There was no drinking, no crew, nobody could have anything around them. You have to keep in mind, they went through a very rough patch in the 70s with drugs and everything, and they wanted to make sure that they were totally clear, their surroundings were totally clear. Now this is something that the Black Crowes should have learned about, because in this book, Gorman tells a lot of stories about how band members would get fucked up on drugs and they would leave and they'd come back clean maybe at some later point, only to fall off the wagon again, because the whole environment of going on tour, it lends itself to drinking, you know, the stress and just being bored maybe, or the other guys in the band are doing drugs, and so you kind of fall into it again, you know, whether it's alcohol or cocaine or whatever. And so Aerosmith had learned this lesson, and so they basically tried to distance themselves from the Black Crowes as much as possible, because the Black Crowes were definitely a party band. Now, to make matters worse, Chris Robinson at this point, when he was doing interviews, he would bust out Aerosmith and talk shit about them, how they were using these pre-recorded backing tracks. The band did not like that. Joe Perry wanted the Black Crowes thrown off the tour. He said that they sucked, were not a real rock band, and really wanted Skid Row on the tour. Now, they had a much better experience opening for Robert Plant in 1990 on his Manic Nirvana tour, which was the first time that I got to see the Black Crowes back in October 1990 in Richmond, Virginia. And, you know, Robert treated them very, very well. As a matter of fact, they referred to him as Uncle Bob. He would take them sightseeing around the various towns that they would hit. He would take them to like these antique shops. And in his book, Gorman talks about, you know, this image that Robert Plant has of, you know, being into like world music and into like Americana. That was all very, very genuine. He was genuinely interested in like the local culture and wanted to immerse himself in it wherever he wound up being. And one of the things that I like about these memoirs is you get to hear these quirky little stories, like the one he tells about Vanilla Ice. He says Vanilla Ice was sitting on the drum riser. He was the single biggest thing in pop music right then. He was wearing those crazy ass pants. He had the ridiculous hair, the whole getup. As I approached, he looked up at me. "Get away from those drums, dude. What the fuck are you doing up there?" I said, scowling. "Oh, sorry, dude. It's cool," he squealed and ran off to the backstage area. I started to say, "Man, I'm just fucking with you," but I stopped myself. It was funny to see him run off like that, actually. Plus, I couldn't stand that he had ripped off Queen for his big hit. So yeah, fuck off, dude. You know, one thing that you learn from reading this book is how much the rest of the band mattered to the Black Crowes. They weren't just this band that was fronted by Rich and Chris and everybody else. It didn't matter. As band members came in, like Marc Ford and Sven Pippen, especially Eddie Harsch on keys, the band, Gorman said, was elevated to like another level, and the chemistry just got better, and they played better and better. Now, along with that came some other elements, like when Eddie Harsch came into the band, he was a big-time druggie. Now, Eddie sadly passed away 2016, but Gorman talks about how Eddie brought in drugs. Not that the band didn't already have drugs, but Chris had somebody that he could have fun with in doing drugs, because Eddie made drugs fun. Like he could make a bong out of anything, you know, like a plastic cup, a power strip, a television. He could smoke it no matter what you had. And, you know, Steve does make a point in this book to say that, you know, while Eddie Harsch isn't the reason why the band did drugs, it kind of ushered in this new phase that never ended. And drugs were very pervasive in the Black Crowes, and it got in the way of decision making, all kinds of relationships strained within the band. You had band members who were on drugs, needed to get sober. They did. They came back in the band, and because there was a lot of using going on with other guys, they fell off the wagon again. And in terms of Chris, this is what Gorman had to say about Chris Robinson and his cocaine addiction. So he says, for Chris, cocaine was probably the worst drug he could have taken, as it exacerbated all his faults. It's in Chris's nature to act like a cult leader. He wanted to be surrounded by people who loved him, feared him, and would never challenge him. Add cocaine to that mix, and you wound up with a full-blown megalomaniac who lived inside a cocoon. So, while the first Crows album, Shake Your Moneymaker, had a very derivative Stones kind of sound, the second album, the Southern Harmony and Musical Companion, this marked them coming into their own, and you can really hear their own style coming through. Songs like Remedy and, Thorn in My Pride, Sting Me, lots of great songs on this album, and it started to blow up too. And Chris went from being more of the catalyst and being a creative source to wanting to run more things. He wanted to take over more areas of the band as the band started to become more and more popular. I mean, shouldn't be a shocker when you consider, how much of a dick he is to his own brother. You know what I mean? So if you can't treat your brother right, how are you going to treat other people? Whether other people in your band or people outside. I mean, you saw how he was talking shit about Aerosmith, and management was getting on him like, look, you got to keep your trap shut. You can't keep talking shit about people you're on the tour with. But Chris, he had a mind of his own. So they went on tour with ZZ Top for their second tour in 1991. This is actually the second time that I got to see the Black Crowes, because I was going to see ZZ Top. And I remember when I went to see this show, hearing in the news about how Chris Robinson was against corporate sponsorship. There was a lot of controversy over that brewing. And I wondered where that all came from. Well, Steve Gorman shed some light on it in this book. What basically happened was Chris was being interviewed, and they were talking about drinking and everything, and the guy said to Chris, well, you must drink a light beer, because he's like a skinny guy. And Chris said, I don't drink no light beer. I don't care about that shit. And so what wound up going in the paper was that Chris didn't like L-I-T-E beer instead of L-I-G-H-T beer. It's a big, big difference, because when you say you don't like L-I-T-E beer, that's a brand. They were sponsoring the tour. And so word got out that Chris was talking shit about the sponsor. ZZ Top's management said, you got to shut up about this. Of course, Chris, being the dick that he is, he's like, fuck you, don't tell me what to say. And so this started a lot of trouble behind the scenes. And of course, Chris has to run his mouth, just like he did with the whole Aerosmith thing. He would tell the audience, after the set was done, that their set was brought to you by the Black Crowes and no corporate sponsors and everything. And of course, ZZ Top's people were flipping out, and they were threatening to throw him off the tour. But one of the other things about this book that's really cool is it goes to show you how when you've got a really good manager, he can, like the old saying, if life gives you lemons, make lemonade. And that's what a really good manager does. And so their manager, Pete Angelus, he was always trying to stitch things back together when the Robinson brothers would fuck stuff up. So in this case, he told Chris, he's like, look, just shut up, don't say anything. I'm going to try to work this to our advantage. So Chris, to his credit, he played ball while Pete worked some magic behind the scenes. And what Pete was doing was setting up an interview with Rockline, which is like this weekly talk show that aired across radio stations, and also set up an interview with Rolling Stone magazine. So once he had those set up, he told Chris, all right, let it fly. Next show, Chris goes out, tells the crowd, this is brought to you by the Black Crowes. We don't do no fucking sponsorships. ZZ Top's management they blow a fucking gasket. They tell the Black Crowes, you're fired, you're off the tour. So what does he do? He goes on to Rockline and gives this interview with Rockline, tells them that they just got thrown off the tour, interview with Rolling Stone. They get their face on the cover of Rolling Stone magazine, articles about how they just got thrown off the tour. They're the bad boys. They're getting all this press. And so, yeah, Pete Angelus took this situation of the band getting thrown off the tour where they could have been unhireable and turned it around so that they become the most desirable. And what's interesting is this other story that Steve Gorman tells about another tour that came up later where corporate sponsorship came up. And this story gives you some insight into the brain of Chris Robinson, okay? Check this out. Pete started off the meeting with a laugh, saying, well, guys, good news. Bud Light has offered to sponsor our tour. We all laughed, but then Pete said he had actually received a phone call from someone at Bud Light. They had offered to back our tour for $1 million. Pete said, can you believe these fucking guys? After a moment or two, Chris said, how much would that be per person? Pete laughed. Oh, so we're going to take some Budweiser money now? He assumed it was a joke. No, seriously, how much, Chris said. I mean, that's a lot of money, right? The rest of us, even Rich, looked at each other, and came to accept in that moment something that was no longer avoidable. We had a madman at the helm. So yeah, this whole thing gives you a clue into the mind of Chris Robinson. It's like he really didn't care about the corporate sponsorship. He was just talking. It was just talk. He just didn't, when you get down to it, he didn't like somebody telling him what to do. And because of that, look at what he put into jeopardy. Plus, certainly having the drugs on top of all this, it did not help. And something else that did not help was Chris Robinson suddenly becoming a deadhead. That's right. He started becoming interested in the Grateful Dead, going to their shows. At one point, Chris Robinson used to mock the Grateful Dead and Deadheads. And here he was going to see them and basically coming away with this idea that the Black Crowes needed to incorporate the Grateful Dead into their, not just into their own sound, but into their presentation. And here's what Gorman had to say about that. He says, during the High as the Moon tour, Chris went to see the Dead a few times, and that's when his burgeoning fandom started to influence his approach to the Black Crowes. They just stand there, man, he told us one day. They just play, and that's it. It's just about the music, and they're fucking wasted. They don't have to worry about a fucking light show or performing for the crowd. They're real musicians. Oh, holy hell. Suddenly we're not real musicians? Suddenly it's cool to just stand there? And then Chris went through this phase where he, hung out with the Rolling Stones while they were recording the Voodoo Lounge album. And he came away from that, we got to be more of a rock band, and so this was like another change of gears, and talked about how, he wanted the next album cover to be provocative, and he proposed this album cover with the bikini bottom with like pubic hair coming out. And, nobody liked that idea because no one's going to carry that album. Walmart, Best Buy, and Chris's attitude is like, fuck those guys, But it's like, if they don't carry your album, how are you going to sell it? But he didn't give a shit about any of that. And Gorman talks about that in the book too. The record label hated the cover for the obvious reasons. Many retailers were not going to stock an album with pubic hair on it, but Chris refused to budge. He talked himself into thinking he was actually taking a principled stand. To this day, I think the Amorica cover looks more like a Motley Crue record. It's like when Spinal Tap put out Smell the Glove. Chris was our very own Nigel Tufnell wondering, what's wrong with being sexy? It's juvenile, embarrassing, and most importantly, it has zero connection to the music. Sure enough, 6 months later, Best Buy was not carrying Amorica, and Walmart was not carrying Amorica, and a bunch of other stores didn't sell Amorica either. Kneecapped before the race even started. Great. Thanks, man. It's funny how there's the parallel to Spinal Tap, because the cover that they actually wound up with was a black album cover with the bikini bottom on it, kind of like Smell the Glove in Spinal Tap. Like, how much more black could it be? None more black. And so, by the end of the 90s, the Black Crowes were toast. They were having a hard time selling albums. Audiences were just not showing up to the shows like they used to, but they had Jimmy Page, who loved them. He wanted to join their band, actually. He even said that. And he wanted to work with them, so he invited them to be his backing band at a charity concert. That went very, very well. It turned into a tour, the Black Crowes and Jimmy Page. And this is actually the third time that I got to see the Black Crowes. I checked them out on one of their first shows with him at Roseland in New York City. This was in October 1999. And this was such an electric show, one of my favorite shows that I went to go see ever. Amazing performance, so much energy, and they did a lot of, it was mostly Zeppelin stuff. They did some Black Crowes, mostly Zeppelin, just off the charts. Steve Gorman talks in this book about how much he enjoyed it. So they had about 55 shows planned with Jimmy Page, but by the 10th or so, his back was starting to bother him. But he powered through it. And when they got to the West Coast, they appeared on The Tonight Show with Jay Leno, and they ripped through the Wonton Song by Led Zeppelin. Great performance. As a matter of fact, I'm going to throw it into the companion playlist to this video. I'll put a link up to it. Check it out. I've got lots of other clips in there for you too. At the end of that show, Steve Gorman was pulled aside by the manager, Pete Angelus, and he said, look, Jimmy went home. And Steve was like, well, what do you mean? He went home to get his back worked on? He's like, no, Jimmy went home and the tour is over. Everything's over. And Gorman was like, what the hell? Was it his back? And he's like, yeah, he's having issues with his back. And when the Robinson brothers found out about it, Gorman was standing there and they just seemed to blow it off like, well, you know, we've been wanting to play Black Crow stuff again anyway, and they just didn't seem to be too bothered by it. And Steve just never felt right about it. And it wasn't until many years later when he reconnected with Jimmy Page that he found out what really happened. And what had happened was, before the Tonight Show, Jimmy Page went to go see Rich, and he was like, you know, because he knew that the Black Crowes were in a funk and that their next album had to be big. And so he was like, look, if there's anything that I can do to help you guys, I'm glad to help you. Maybe I can do a guitar solo. I've got, you know, stuff that we can co-write, you know, whatever you want to do. So this is what Steve Gorman recollects about his conversation with Jimmy Page about his talk with Rich. He says, Rich didn't say much at first, Jimmy added, but I'd had another idea and I thought this was the best one. I'd been working on some riffs for Page Plant, but Robert never wanted to work on them. So I said, why don't you and I sit down with Chris, let's flesh them out, finish the songs. We'll put all three of our names on them as co-write. I thought they could fit very well with the band if you guys liked them. I was excited about that. I thought it would be fun. You know what he said to me, Jimmy asked, still genuinely mystified by what he was about to share? No thanks, we're good. All the new songs that Chris and I are writing are great. They're the best we've ever had, really, and there's a lot of them. We don't need more songs. That's all he said. Jimmy continued. So I said, well, okay then. I walked back to my room thinking, what am I doing here? Why am I even working with this guy? I'd been willing to give it a real go, and then I realized I just couldn't do that anymore for someone who didn't appreciate me. It was impossible to process. Jimmy loved playing with us. We loved playing with him, and Rich took that away. So yeah, again, another example of how the Robinson brothers fucked stuff up. So another layer to this whole Black Crowes story are the women that would come in and out of Chris Robinson's life, or as Steve Gorman would call them, a murderous row, except for one woman, Kate Hudson, who he actually married in 2000. Now, Kate is the daughter of actress Goldie Hawn. And Gorman talks about how when she came into Chris's life, she, you know, kind of brought some sense to him. You know, she didn't want him to do drugs. She wanted him to get right with Rich. And he was a much better person to be around. And so, you know, fights kind of stopped during that time. And they wound up getting married, too. And there were a lot of bets as to, you know, how long the marriage would actually last. I mean, the betting started on the wedding day. There was a cool story about that in the book, too. As we were having cocktails before dinner, now this is at the wedding, the shtick was running pretty thick. The over-under on the length of marriage was set at 3.5 years. I mentioned it to Kurt Russell, and he said, well, I love Kate to death, but hell, give me $20 on the under. I bet everybody was really surprised that the marriage went for 7 years, actually. But, you know, we fast forward to 2014, and now money issues start to take hold in the band like never before. And they were asked to play at Howard Stern's 60th birthday party. How much did Chris Robinson want for himself to play Howard Stern's 60th birthday bash? A, $10,000, B, $25K, C, $100,000, or D, $150,000. The answer is D, $150,000. Now I should add, this is just for himself. You know, this isn't taking into consideration the other guys. His attitude was, fuck Howard Stern. You know, what did he ever do for us? Again, the attitude, people who support you. You know, you got, you know, Best Buy sells your albums. Fuck Best Buy, you know. You got Howard Stern plays your music. Oh, fuck Howard Stern, you know? And so, again, more bridges burned. And, you know, things really peaked in 2015 when the band was about to embark on the 25th anniversary of Shake Your Moneymaker, which is kind of interesting because they're about to do a 30th anniversary tour of Shake Your Moneymaker now, which I'm going to be getting to in just a minute. But back in 2015, they were basically going to do what they're going to do now, except Chris wanted it all. He wanted to take over the band. He wanted to take over everything. He wanted to be paid 75% of the band's profits. He wanted all of Steve Gorman's share. As a matter of fact, the email that went out to the band came from Chris's wife at that time. And this is what it said. I think it's only fair to preface the terms by saying we, her, Chris, and some accountant I'd never heard of, all aforementioned agree that there will be no negotiating or wiggle room when it comes to the percentages below. Continuing forward with the band any other way is just not something my husband is up for emotionally, physically, and spiritually. So basically, the ultimatum was that Chris Robinson was going to be getting 75% of the band's profits, and the other 25 was going to be split amongst whoever else was in the band. Gorman's share totally taken away, reduced to a hired hand, even taking away his flesh and blood, his brother's share. And so, and this is all coming from an email from his wife. It's like, where the fuck does she get off sending an email to the band about shares? It just goes to show you how Chris, was with the wrong type of woman, with a shark who was sticking her nose in business that she had no business doing. And so this completely tanked it. Gorman was like, fuck you, I'm not doing this. And even Rich, as much of a dick as he is, he wasn't going to put up with this. And so the Black Crowes basically folded, and that was it. So over the past 6 years, the Robinson brothers have been involved in their own solo projects, and they haven't been speaking to one another. And when they do, they're talking shit about one another in interviews. Even as earlier as this year, Chris Robinson was talking about how he and his brother kind of hate each other and, almost feels like he doesn't have a brother and this kind of stuff. But then as the year wore on, there were rumblings of a Black Crowes reunion. And this is right around the same time that Steve Gorman's book was getting ready to drop. Oddly enough, Chris and Rich announced that they're getting the Black Crowes back. Now, I should say it's not the whole band or anybody else that was in the band. It's just Chris and Rich and hired hands. They appeared on the Howard Stern show. This is a guy that did nothing for them, right? And so now they're on the Howard Stern show and they're promoting this tour, the 30th anniversary of Shake Your Moneymaker. So this is what they had planned to do in 2015 when it was the 25th, and now it's the 30th. So it's kind of like they're picking up where they should have been 5 or so years ago, and you can pretty much bet that they're probably splitting everything 50-50. They got hired hands, and when you listen to Chris talk, he's in this relationship now with, apparently he's got another Kate Hudson type, somebody that's talked some sense into him, how come you don't get along with your brother? How come your kids don't know Uncle Rich? How come I've never met your brother? Stuff like that. And, Chris didn't really have a good answer for that, because he never really had a deep-rooted problem with Rich. He was just being a dick. He was on drugs. He was a control freak. Chris has been in therapy for many, many years. He really didn't have a solid reason. And so, through some mutual friends, they were able to kind of chill out. And so they decided to give it another try. Steve Gorman, the way he feels about this whole thing, it's kind of sad. He calls it very, very sad. It's not the Black Crowes. When you read this book, you hear about who the Black Crowes really, really were. And it was more than just Chris and Rich. There was a chemistry there that has been dissolved. And that's one of the biggest, I think it's more bittersweet. Look, I always love it when brothers get along. You hate to see them fighting and punching the balls off one another. But look at what the cost is. Look at the effect that it's had. All the relationships that have been strained, the collateral damage. Steve Gorman, the co-founder, you got to have him on drums, but he's not going to be a part of this. Marc Ford, the guitar player, he's not going to be a part of this. The Black Crowes are completely different now. And this is a band that should be greater than they are. At the 30-year mark, they should all be going out and kicking ass as the Black Crowes, as a unit, the way they once were. But now they're in a rebuilding phase because these two fucking knuckleheads were such assholes. And now look at what they're left with. You know, when the Black Crowes were first getting started, they modeled themselves after the Rolling Stones. And Steve Gorman talks about the first time that the band met Keith Richards. Chuck Leavell was there, the keyboard player. And he says, hey, Keith, you know the Black Crowes? Asked Chuck. Without breaking stride, Keith looked us all up and down. Know 'em? Hell, I wrote 'em, baby. We all fell out laughing. Best line ever. We loved it. My first time around Keith, and damned if he wasn't better than advertised. And you know, what's really sad about this whole thing is that while the Black Crowes modeled themselves after the Rolling Stones, they missed one major piece. I mean, yeah, Jagger and Richards, classic songwriting team, but they were not the Rolling Stones by themselves. What about Mick Taylor, the great guitar player that they had? What about Charlie Watts? He's still with them, the drummer. You can't pull Charlie Watts out of the Rolling Stones. His timing and his style is essential. You gotta have him. And I think the same can be said for the Black Crowes. The Black Crowes were much, much more than just Chris and Rich Robinson. It was Steve Gorman, it was Marc Ford, Sven Pippen, and certainly Eddie Harsch, and others. And so it's very sad to see these brothers take this band and drag it down and make stupid decisions. They made decisions for the entire band when they fucked up stuff. And now here they are, 30th anniversary, and it's just the two of them. I hope that Chris has learned some things, has some tools that he's picked up, so that when this relationship that he's got now, if it goes south, he and his brother can still have peace. Maybe Chris has learned something. You hope so, but who knows? What do you think? Do you think this Black Crowes reunion is short-lived? Are they going to start punching the balls off one another before it's all over with? Let me know what you think. Have you read the book by Steve Gorman? If you haven't, go pick it up. It's a great read. Let me know what you think about the Black Crowes. Drop the comments below, because when this video ends, the conversation keeps going in the comment section, all right? And be sure to check out the companion playlist. Click like if you like this video. Other fans will see it, and hit that subscribe button too, all right? And I'll be back soon with another video. Take care.